The rain had been falling for hours, soaking the city streets in a dull shimmer of gray. As his luxury car slowed near the bus stop, Alexander Wright, a self-made millionaire and CEO of one of the country's fastest-growing companies, noticed a young woman slumped on the bench. She wasn't waiting for the bus. She was asleep, her head resting against her arm, her nurse's uniform still on. The sight pulled at him. Even through the fogged windows, he could see the exhaustion on her face. He told himself it wasn't his problem and the driver should keep going, but the image stayed with him all night. The night was quiet except for the steady patter of rain against the windshield. City lights smeared into long streaks of gold and red as the driver steered Alexander's sleek black sedan down the nearly empty street. Inside, Alexander leaned back against the leather seat, scrolling through emails on his phone, his mind busy with numbers and contracts. His world was measured in profits and losses, deals and deadlines. There was little room for anything else. But then, as the car slowed near a bus stop, something caught his eye. A figure hunched over on the bench, unmoving, almost blending into the shadow. Alexander frowned and lowered his phone, squinting through the misted glass. The streetlight overhead flickered, briefly illuminating a young woman curled up on the cold, metal seat. Her head rested awkwardly on her arm, her nurse's uniform dampened by the drizzle. Her shoes were scuffed, her posture heavy with exhaustion. She wasn't waiting for the bus, she was simply too tired to keep going. "Sir, shall I continue?" the driver asked, glancing at him through the mirror. Alexander hesitated. Normally, he would have waved the question off without thought. This city was filled with people struggling, people invisible to men like him. But there was something about her, something that made it impossible to look away. Perhaps it was the pale weariness of her face even in sleep, or the way her uniform marked her as someone who spent her days caring for others while no one seemed to care for her. For a moment, an unfamiliar ache stirred in his chest. He thought of how different their worlds were. His, lined with glass towers and penthouse views, hers, marked by long hours and silent sacrifices. He imagined her finishing a night shift, too drained to make it home, left vulnerable to the rain and the night. "Keep driving," Alexander finally muttered, turning his gaze back to the window. But even as the car pulled away, he found himself glancing back, craning for one last look until the figure disappeared into the blur of darkness. He returned to his phone, but the screen no longer held his attention. Numbers and words blurred before his eyes, replaced by the image of a sleeping nurse at a lonely bus stop, and for the first time in years, Alexander felt a nagging weight he couldn't explain. The next morning, Alexander sat in his office, staring out at the skyline that stretched like a crown of steel and glass. Usually, the view filled him with pride, a daily reminder of the empire he had built from nothing. But today, the city looked different, colder, heavier, as if last night's rain had washed away its shine. He had barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her again, the nurse at the bus stop, slumped under the streetlight with the rain soaking her uniform. He told himself it was none of his business, that she was just one of thousands fighting their own battles in the city. Yet the image clung to him, refusing to loosen its grip. By noon, his desk was cluttered with contracts awaiting his signature, emails demanding urgent replies, and a flashing phone that hadn't stopped buzzing with calls from board members. But Alexander wasn't listening. His assistant had to repeat questions twice before he responded. His mind was elsewhere. Finally, unable to bear it, he set the phone down, pushed back from his desk, and pressed the intercom. "Get the car. Same route as last night," he ordered. The driver raised an eyebrow when Alexander gave the instruction but said nothing. Soon, the sedan was weaving through traffic, retracing the path from the night before. Alexander's eyes were fixed on the window, his chest tight with anticipation. Would she be there? Would he even recognize her if she was awake? As they turned the corner, he saw her, sitting upright on the same bench, her shoulders drooping, her hair tied back loosely. She was awake now, sipping from a cheap paper cup of coffee, her gaze distant. Even in daylight, her exhaustion was unmistakable. Her uniform looked freshly worn, as though she had finished another long shift and hadn't yet made it home. "Stop the car," Alexander said, sharper than intended. He stepped out into the drizzle without waiting for an umbrella. For a man used to boardrooms and luxury, the cold air bit against his tailored suit, but he hardly noticed. He approached the bus stop cautiously, unsure of what to say. The young woman blinked up at him, startled by the sudden presence of a stranger who didn't belong in her world. "Good morning," Alexander said softly, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. I saw you here last night." For the first time in years, the millionaire found himself nervous, not about a business deal, but about the story behind a tired nurse's eyes. For a moment, Emma just stared at him, unsure how to respond. Strangers didn't usually stop to talk to her, let alone well-dressed men who looked like they belonged on magazine covers. She hesitated, clutching her paper cup tighter, as if it were a shield. "I'm sorry," she said finally, her voice hoarse. "I didn't mean to bother anyone last night. I must have fallen asleep waiting." Alexander shook his head. "You weren't bothering me," he replied gently. "You just looked tired." More than tired. Something in his tone, curiosity without pity, concern without judgment, unlocked something in her. She let out a shaky breath, her eyes fixed on the wet pavement as words tumbled out almost against her will. "I'm a nurse," she began quietly. "I work at St. Mary's Hospital. Most weeks, I pick up double shifts. Sometimes triple." She gave a small, bitter laugh. "They say I should rest more, but rest doesn't pay bills." Alexander listened intently, his hands loosely in his pockets. "My mom's sick," Emma continued, her voice wavering. "Cancer. Treatments are expensive, and insurance barely covers half. I can't afford to live close to the hospital anymore, so I take 2 buses to get home. But sometimes," she swallowed hard, "sometimes I just can't make it. I sit down here to wait, and the exhaustion wins. Next thing I know, it's morning." She tried to smile, as though apologizing for saying too much. "It's not ideal, I know. But it's temporary. It has to be." Alexander's chest tightened. He saw the dark circles under her eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly as she gripped her cup, the quiet dignity in her posture even as she admitted how hard life had become. She wasn't asking for sympathy, she was simply explaining her reality. "You do all of that for your mother?" he asked softly. Emma nodded, blinking quickly to hold back tears. "She did everything for me growing up. It's my turn now. I just wish," her voice broke for a moment before she steadied herself. "I just wish it didn't feel like I'm running on empty all the time." For a long moment, silence hung between them, filled only by the sound of distant traffic and the whisper of rain. And in that silence, Alexander realized he was no longer standing at a bus stop, he was standing at a crossroads in his own life. Back in his office high above the city, Alexander sat behind his vast mahogany desk, but for once, the empire spread out before him brought no sense of triumph. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the skyline in sharp lines and silver light, yet all he saw was a weary young woman in a damp nurse's uniform, clutching a paper cup as though it were her last source of warmth. He leaned back in his chair, loosening his tie. Normally, the day after a late night, he'd dive straight into contracts and strategy calls, but every folder, every deal on his desk suddenly seemed trivial. What good was another million in revenue when someone like Emma, someone who dedicated her life to healing, could barely afford a roof over her head? The memory of her words echoed in him. "It's my turn now." The quiet strength in her voice had stirred something buried deep, something he had long silenced with ambition. He thought of his own mother, how she had worked double shifts as a waitress, never once complaining, even when her hands were raw and her back ached. He had promised himself that he'd build a life where neither of them would ever suffer again. And he had succeeded, at least for himself. But somewhere along the way, he had stopped looking at people like his mother, people like Emma. He rubbed his temples, frustration gnawing at him. He had influence, wealth, the power to change things, but he had always used those tools for expansion, for winning, for status. Wasn't there more to life than that? "Sir, the investors are waiting on your decision about the merger," his assistant's voice buzzed over the intercom. Alexander stared at the blinking light on the phone, but he didn't press it. The merger, the numbers, the board, all of it felt meaningless compared to the urgency of one nurse's struggle. He rose suddenly, pacing the length of his office. His mind raced, not with strategies, but with possibilities. What if he could do more than just write a check? What if he could create something lasting, something that gave people like Emma the dignity and support they deserved? That night, Long after the building had emptied and the city had gone quiet, Alexander picked up the phone. He called his lawyer, then his financial advisor. By the time he hung up, a plan had begun to take shape, one that would demand more from him than money, but would give back more than he had ever gained. For the first time in years, Alexander felt a spark of purpose beyond the walls of his empire. The following morning dawned gray, the city shrouded in a misty drizzle. Alexander's driver glanced at him in the rearview mirror, clearly puzzled by the unusual request to take the same route yet again. But Alexander only sat quietly, a slim leather envelope resting on his lap, his fingers tapping against it as though it carried something heavier than paper. As they turned the familiar corner, his eyes sought her immediately. And there she was, Emma, sitting on the same worn bench, sipping her coffee, her uniform neat but her expression weary. She looked up in surprise when the sleek black sedan slowed to a stop in front of her. This time, Alexander didn't hesitate. He stepped out, the chill biting against his tailored coat. Emma rose awkwardly to her feet, clearly uncertain why this stranger had returned. "You again," she said softly, half in surprise, half in guarded curiosity. "Yes," Alexander replied, his voice gentler than he had intended. "I wanted to see you." Her brows knit together, and before she could respond, he held out the envelope. She stared at it, then at him. "What is this?" "Open it," he urged. Slowly, with trembling fingers, she slid the paper free. Inside was a check, an amount large enough to cover months of hospital bills, rent, and more. But what caught her breath was the letter folded neatly behind it. She unfolded the page, her eyes scanning the words in disbelief. "I'm funding a new health clinic," Alexander explained, watching her closely. "State-of-the-art, affordable care for families who need it most. But a clinic like that doesn't run on money alone, it needs heart. It needs someone like you to lead it. Head nurse, full salary, full support." Emma's hand flew to her mouth. Tears brimmed in her eyes as the words blurred on the page. I don't understand. Why me?" Alexander's gaze softened. "Because last night, I saw someone who gives everything and asks for nothing. Because I know what it's like to watch someone you love suffer, and I know the strength it takes to keep going. You shouldn't have to fight alone." Her tears spilled freely now, cutting silent tracks down her cheeks. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered. "Don't," Alexander said simply, his voice thick with sincerity. "Just keep doing what you already do. Save lives. Give hope." At the bus stop that morning, Emma's world shifted forever, not because of the check or the job, but because someone finally saw her worth. Months later, the city's gray drizzle was replaced by clear skies as a crowd gathered in front of a gleaming new building. The sign above the doors read, "Starlight Community Health Clinic." For the families who had been waiting in long hospital lines and scraping together money for treatments, this place was more than a clinic, it was a promise of hope. Emma stood at the entrance, her nurse's uniform crisp, her posture straighter than it had been in years. Gone were the shadows under her eyes, replaced with a light that came from within. She held the ceremonial ribbon-cutting scissors in her hands, though her fingers trembled with nerves. This was no longer just another hospital shift. This was her clinic, her chance to build the kind of care she had always dreamed of. Reporters snapped photos, children waved balloons, and volunteers in fresh uniforms bustled about, preparing to welcome the first patients. Emma spotted her mother sitting in the front row, her face glowing with pride, her illness finally under control thanks to treatments Emma could now afford. The sight made Emma's chest tighten with gratitude. And then, standing a little apart from the crowd, she saw him, Alexander. He wasn't on the stage, nor did he seek the spotlight. He stood quietly in the back, hands in his pockets, watching with a faint, almost private smile. He had funded the clinic, organized its foundation, and pulled every string necessary to make it real. But he wanted the moment to belong to Emma. Their eyes met, and for a heartbeat, the noise of the crowd faded. She gave him a small nod, a silent thank you. He nodded back, as if to say, "You earned this. You belong here." When Emma cut the ribbon, cheers erupted. The doors swung open, and families streamed inside, their faces filled with hope. Emma greeted the first patients personally, her voice calm and warm, her confidence blooming with every handshake and smile. From his place in the shadows, Alexander felt something stir deep within him. Not the pride of a CEO watching another investment succeed, but the quiet fulfillment of a man who had finally chosen to use his wealth for something greater than himself. For Emma, the bus stop was now a memory of exhaustion. For Alexander, it was the place where his perspective had shifted forever. And for both of them, the clinic's opening marked not an ending, but the beginning of something far more lasting, proof that one encounter on a rainy night could change 2 lives, and countless others. Forever.